Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As you probably gather, don't speak any Spanish, but I'm glad that you have a translation for those who can understand this. And thank you, Letitia, for the kind words. And I should like to add that my co-frame historian, author Lynn Roberts, has been largely instrumental in helping put this together. I discussed the program, and we decided that this would be the most appropriate way to demonstrate this enormous year of frame expertise, history, and exhibitions that took place in 1996 in London. 1996 was an extremely exciting year to be working with antique frames and historic picture frames in London, as two major and a minor exhibition opened and 3 accompanying books on frames were published. As Sir Timothy Clifford, director of the National Galleries of Scotland, wrote in the foreword of one of the book's frameworks by myself and Lynn Roberts, for London, 1996 is to be something of an annus mirabilis for frame research, with a show at the National Portrait Gallery devised by Jacob Simon, another show with Paul Mitchell Limited, and 2 excellent publications by Paul Mitchell and Lynn Roberts. Earlier in this foreword, Timothy Clifford had pointed out that bad things happen to frames out of either ignorance or sheer perversity. An historic building cannot be altered without planning permission, yet a great picture can be separated from its original frame, and few people seem remotely concerned. By 1996, however, there were enough concerned people and enough scholarship advancing to reach a tipping point, just as much earlier national movements had formed to protect historic houses. It was a coincidence. Excuse me, we need to check. Yes. It was a coincidence that the Macmillan Dictionary of Art, now the Grove Dictionary of Art, was published in 1996 with the huge section on frames in volume 11, which became a history of European picture frames. Hugh Brigstock, first editor of the Macmillan Dictionary of Art, wrote in the preface to A History of European Picture Frames that, after discussing with Paul Mitchell the scope and range of his projected article on European frames for the Dictionary of Art, I quickly appreciated that this would be a microcosm of what I had hoped to achieve through the 34 volumes of the dictionary, epitomizing its complex structure of cultural cross-references and examining the origins of the art form in the widest possible historical context. In this same year, when Jacob Simon organized his exhibition at the NPG, he also published a complementary book, The Art of the Picture Frame, writing in the introduction, I have deliberately chosen to focus on the National Portrait Gallery's collection, which is probably the most comprehensive single collection covering the history of framing in Britain over the last 500 years. It is the best display of its kind, arranged in chronological order and available for permanent study, so that this book will form a guide to the collection and to framing in Britain even after the close of the exhibition. Right, we were meant to be looking at that. That's it, let's switch around. Finally, a third small exhibition, again in the same year, was staged at Arnold Wiggins and Sons in St. James's, a hang of English frames, 1620 to 1920, including frames with makers' labels. The labels were either very late 18th or early 19th century. So turning to the National Portrait Gallery exhibition itself, here we see the actual entrance and the publications. We see that Jacob Simon, who will be your speaker here in 2 weeks' time, curator of this exhibition and also then curator of 18th century paintings at the NPG, had become interested in frames during his first 2 jobs, working in the historic houses Temple Newsome in Leeds and Kenwood in London. Here he saw the frames of the art collections, recognized that they formed a bridge between the wider setting and the picture itself. When he arrived at the NPG, he found a collection of about 4,000 oil paintings, the frames of which had never been studied. Starting with a detailed review of the frames of one artist, Alan Ramsey, through an exhibition of his work held at the MPG in 1992, he moved on to the idea of a small study exhibition based on the whole history of the British frame, illustrated from the gallery's own collection. This exhibition and accompanying book were educational in their conception and aim, as the idea of looking at the frame rather than the painting and of seeing what effect the frame might have on the painting were completely novel to most of the public. The small display originally proposed in a basement gallery changed when a larger conventional exhibition was lost from the NPG's calendar, leaving the main exhibition room free. The project at once increased dramatically in importance. It was now intended to comprise a core of around 30 frames with a trail of 100 marked frames extending throughout the collection, so that the whole of the National Portrait Gallery became part of the exhibition. The plan was to include displays on the techniques of frame making with a mock-up workshop studio, historical styles, the choice of frames as influenced by patrons, artists, and frame makers. Jacob Simon notes that the exhibition reflected the dual purpose of understanding the historical and the technical. While there was an outer circuit focusing on the history of framing, there was an inner room devoted to the making of frames in which demonstrations took place quite regularly. In order to achieve this dual purpose, he worked closely with Richard Hallis, the gallery's frame conservator, examining all the relevant frames together and ensuring that both historical and technical perspectives were brought together to provide a detailed understanding of each frame. But a striking point in the planning of this exhibition, marking it out from exhibitions concerned with the fine arts, is the anxiety expressed about it by the curators in the written proposals. They suggested that there might be extra directional signs and a hanging frame before the foyer of the exhibition to whet people's curiosity, that it might be an idea to gild the doorway to the exhibition to emphasize it, and as the estimated cost for oil gilding was £600, this idea was discarded. That the main exhibition room should be screened off from the entrance, and that there should be a spectacular frame containing a picture on this screen, as well as a spectacular arrangement of empty frames, one within the other. This anxiety reflected a feeling that the subject of frames was so novel and potentially so lacking in excitement to a public unused to the idea that frames are historic, beautiful, and interesting objects in their own right, that visitors needed to be lured in. Also, it was feared that visitors would be put off from entering if they could see anything substantial of the exhibition from the entrance. So here we can see the screen across the entrance hung with a dazzling celebrity arrangement to intrigue and beckon in the spectators, although ironically the portrait of Charles I, icon-like and haloed on the left by an unknown artist, is an extraordinary sunburst frame which itself doesn't appear in the catalogue of the exhibition, The Art of the Picture Frame, as it's a one-off design, completely eccentric and unrelated to the general history of the portrait frame in Britain. Its sole use was as bait to tempt people through the entrance. The large oblong exhibition hall was designed with a mock-up of a frame maker's workshop, the studio being at its centre. Spectators were filtered through an area dealing with technique and then into the studio, so that understanding of the construction, materials and finish of the frame in historical eras was emphasised. The introduction included the arrangement of spectacular frames, as we've seen at the beginning, with an explanatory text, Artists, Patrons and the Framing of Portraits in Britain. This is an exhibition of portraits with their frames, showing the development of framing over the past 500 years. Such has been the popularity of portraiture in Britain that the history of picture framing can be told largely through the history of the portrait frame. The exhibition describes the materials and techniques used by picture framers in both making and restoring frames, and examines 4 frame conservation projects in detail. A studio area at the centre of the exhibition supports the displays with demonstrations, a video and hands-on opportunity for visitors. Some empty frames are included to show how frames were made, but otherwise this is intended as an exhibition of frames complete with their pictures. The picture frame has existed for as long as pictures have been movable, and any movable painting requiring a frame to protect it, and even a fixed painting set in panelling, needed some sort of framework. While the frame may have started out as a form of protection, its visual and symbolic purposes soon became as important. The exhibition explores the stylistic development of the frame, showing how changes in framing, fashion reflect those in architecture and the decorative arts in general. Artists and patrons, sometimes aided by the frame maker, must make choices. Which frame or style of frame it is the most suitable for a particular picture. How expensive a frame can be afforded? Does the patron have a setting in mind? These issues, vital to anyone framing an image, are explored in a series of case studies which invite your reaction. The section on technique showed, by using 9 framed pictures and some empty frames in various styles, how frames were constructed, how they were ornamented with carving or applied decoration, and how they were finished, painted, stained, gilded, or silvered. It included a display of frames mainly empty and mainly seen from the back, arranged like an historic exhibition in a double hang, and information in text panels on materials, frame corners, different joints, miters and keys, and frame sides, an exploded Watts frame seen top center, and a papier-mâché frame. It also included 4 case histories of frames from various periods made with different materials and finishes. These included one, a 16th century engaged and painted frame on unknown artist, Henry VIII, demonstrating the construction and original painted finish, with subsequent layers of paint and varnish, and also how it was hung by a ribbon through holes in the back. The second top right is a carved Giltwood frame, probably original to Joseph Highmore's portrait of Samuel Richardson, 1750. This British Rococo pattern had been heavily re-gilded, so that much of the ornamental detail had been lost, and conservation of one corner allowed the original detail to be seen. A papier-mâché frame, lower left, of the 1760s, applied later to Francis Coates' William Romaine portrait of 1758, with losses showing how the frame was built of layers, with a pine base, papier-mâché ornament, white gesso, coloured bowl, a gildus clay, which is known as bowl, a gold leaf. The site ornament was made of gesso, and the whole frame had been re-gilded twice. Finally, on the right bottom, a Victorian Compost frame, probably original for Stephen Pearce, portrait of Captain Sherard Osborne, around 1857, with damage showing the layers of white compo and the pine base. The studio was arranged like a modern frame maker's workshop, with historic features including racks of old frames and a case of antique tools. I've just been enjoying looking at some in your magnificent frame restoration studio with Enrica. The gallery staged practical demonstrations here periodically throughout the exhibition, and a video of gilding was running at other times. Items in the studio could be picked up and handled, so that the visitor could literally get a feel for the parts, fabric, and tools involved in making a frame, and there were wall-mounted boards showing the different types of finishes and layers used in gilding. There was even a display of old nameplates used in the gallery. The section on style took up between a third and a half of the exhibition space and covered changing historical styles in Britain through portrait frames, from the earliest frames in the collections to one of the latest, a span of nearly 500 years. From Henry VII by an unknown artist dating 1505, shown here, with integral arched frame carved from oak, to Antoinette Sibley by Howard Morgan, 1993, in a revival Louis XIII carved Giltwood bay leaf and berry frame, commissioned by the artist after discussion with his frame maker. Because the collection that the exhibition was based on was one of portraits, This meant that a large swathe of framing styles and practices in use before the 16th century was missing. There were obviously no altarpiece frames, although because of the religious Reformation in Britain from 1536 to 40, most altarpieces have vanished. This means that the exhibition was unbalanced to the extent that it disregarded 300 years of picture framing, which would have been unthinkable in Italy, for example, or in Spain. It left out two of the most notable remaining British altarpieces, the Westminster retable and the Despencer retable, beginning its history in the first years of the 16th century. In spite of its restrictions, however, this was the first exhibition to show the development of framing styles in Britain in such a lucid and easily comprehensible way. Additional methods of display were used to illustrate, for example, construction and fashion. In the earliest period, the portrait of Henry VI, around 1540, was hung in a case to show the reverse of the engaged oak frame as well as the front. An engaged frame uses an early method of fitting the painted wooden panel in place by sliding it into grooves in the moulding before the latter is decorated, so that the painting and frame become one object. This example also has hanging holes in the back at the top, strung with a leather cord. A nearby portrait was shown with a replica curtain half concealing it in the style of the 16th century. So you get the general view of the interior of the exhibition here. And also we know that the exhibition continued through all the important patterns of the 17th century. It was striking in this concentrated arrangement of styles to see how the exuberant ornament of auricular and Sansovino frames was adopted in Britain. It arrived through the influence of foreign craftsmen, the purchase of continental frame paintings, travels of collectors in Europe, and the introduction of printed albums and pattern books. Gilding was also used much more generously than in the 16th century. Another strand of influence is the French Louis XIII style, a garland of bunched leaves seen in the famous frame made for John Hales's portrait of the diarist Samuel Pepys, shown on the bottom right, which is finished in silver leaf rather than gold. Pepys noted in his diary, which he spent a lot of time noting things in, that the portrait cost £14 and the frame £1.25, which is almost 10%. The 18th century display included, on the left here, a Kent or Palladian frame with outset corners, a sanded frieze, pendant oak leaves at the sides, and carved scallop shells in the corners. This beautifully made, rich but restrained architectural design was probably executed in 1742 by Isaac Gossett, an important Huguenot framemaker used by the artist Arthur Pond. It is a characteristic British style as against the curves of the imported French Rococo style seen on the right in a British interpretation on the portrait by Sir Joshua Reynolds 30 years later than the Kent frame. Another peculiarly British style is the Carlo Muratta, introduced from the 1750s by gentlemen who had undertaken the grand tour to Italy and encountered the Roman version, the Salvator Rosa, as a gallery frame. The exhibition used various examples of this from its collection to illustrate the different enrichments employed in this pattern. Here, in two versions to left and right, used by the artist Francis Coates on his portraits, the second more neoclassical with its fluted hollow. The central portrait by William Hoare is framed in another example of a British Rococo pattern, again by the Huguenot craftsman Isaac Gossett. Rococo styles never had quite such a strong hold in Britain as in France, since there was little Rococo architecture. The native styles were classical, into which Palladian, Kent, Carlo Muratta, and late 18th century neoclassical styles fitted more happily. 19th century frame design suffered a slump as industrialization brought in mechanized processes of turning wooden moldings in quantity and applying pressed composition ornament. Carvers rapidly decreased in numbers, but in the middle of the 19th century there was a revival of interest in design and craftsmanship, and by the end of the century, prominent painters were commissioning replicas of earlier historical styles from various countries. This practice continued well into the 20th century, especially for portraits, as the MPG was able to illustrate with these three portraits by Sargent in an Italianate garland of fruit and flowers, and on the left, de Laszlo in a Spanish-style Baroque frame, and Augustus John in a Netherlandish-style ebonized ripple frame. The white frame on Gluck's self-portrait is a copy used by the artist for small pictures of the gilt reeded frames designed by Whistler for his work from the 1870s. The remaining section of the exhibition was choosing a frame, which covered the part played by the artist, the patron, and the frame maker in selecting the most suitable style, degree of decoration within style, and price of frame for the particular painting. This would be modified by the input of the architect through the influence of the interior for which the painting was intended, and/or through the influence the architect had exerted. Sorry, this could be my phone causing a problem here. This would be modified by the input of the architect through the influence of the interior for which the painting was intended, and/or through the influence the architect had exerted on current decorative style to produce a fashionable pattern of frame, for instance, William Kent. These factors are of huge importance throughout the whole history of framing and explain why the choosing section of the exhibition was so large. The key piece of the exhibition from this point of view is the portrait of Shakespeare, known as the Chandos portrait. This is very important to the gallery in that it was its very first acquisition in 1856. Also, it is the only portrait of the internationally famous playwright and poet with any claim to have been painted from life, possibly by John Taylor in the 1600s. Because it is so important, it has been reframed several times. It arrived in the 18th century Maratta frame on the left, which was given the compost shells in the corners in the early 19th century. In 1864, the well-known firm of Ford and Dickinson reframed it in a mock 17th century design in the center. And in 1983, it was reframed again in an antique tortoiseshell frame. It remains in the latter, although it is not a contemporary frame, as an aesthetic choice, as the cassetta form suits the painting and the tortoiseshell complements its colouring. The architect's role in framing choices had perhaps never been adequately considered before. Here on the left, one of 41 portraits of members of the famous Kit Kat Club, all painted by Sir Godfrey Kneller between 1697 and 1717, is shown in one of the set of Kent frames commissioned in 1733 by the sitter Jacob Tonson, who had also had a pavilion designed in Kent style to display the paintings. The set of frames cost £85.15 or to be carved and gilded. In this case, the individual work of art is subsumed by the grouping of related works in identical or similar frames within an architect-designed interior. The display on the right shows three frame choices by artists. From left to right, Ari Scheffer's Royal Academy exhibition frame for his 1855 portrait of Charles Dickens. Sir George Hayter using a mid-18th century French Rococo frame for his 1820s self-portrait, and Sir Oswald Burley choosing an early 17th century Italian cassetta frame for his portrait of George V around about 1935. The portrait on the extreme right is a trophy frame designed by a friend of the deceased subject in order to pay tribute to her accomplishments. So the author and collector, Horace Walpole, created the group of musical instruments on the crest of the frame and the artist's tools at the bottom, and wrote the tribute inscribed on the palette. The carver and gilder who made this extraordinary sculptural and detailed frame is not recorded. frame makers indeed are the shadowy figures in the history of these objects, since they rarely sign their work, and their ephemeral paper records, labels, invoices, letters and receipts have frequently been destroyed. The exhibition included cases containing some surviving bills, account books and artist ledgers from the 17th to the 20th century, which preserve some names, descriptions of frames and prices. In discussing the sort of impact the exhibition has had, one would say that a footnote to this exhibition, which should not be ignored, was the bookshop, more educational in content than similar shops for other exhibitions. The major part was filled with books on frames, the art of the picture frame, the history of European picture frames, frameworks in perfect harmony, etc. The rest consisted of posters, cards and gift bags decorated with the exhibition logo of an arrangement of frame corners and a selection of cardboard reproductions of selected frame styles from which the exhibition could be used to hold postcards or photos. This could be considered a sort of subliminal education which would continue beyond the bounds of the actual exhibition, as with the books, and was subtly different from the usual exhibition souvenirs of scarves, chocolates, jewellery and fridge magnets. Excuse me. A much more influential and important footnote or consequence of the exhibition was the launch in 1997 of a section devoted to framing on the National Portrait Gallery website. This section continues and has expanded significantly during the intervening years. It contains articles on frames in various collections, such as the National Gallery London and the Gemälde Gallery Dresden, essays on frames used by specific artists, a bibliography which carries on from the one in the book, The Art of the Picture Frame, links to relevant websites, reviews of frame conferences, and most significantly, the Directory of British Picture Frame Makers, 1610 to 1950, which is now in its third edition and contains a huge amount of meticulously researched information on those most shadowy figures, the carvers and gilders, who created so many refined and beautiful objects. This directory or dictionary is an immensely important resource to everyone researching and writing about picture frames. So that concludes the first part here, which is the NPG, and we now move to, with luck, So, Frameworks was the title we chose for this exhibition for various obvious reasons. Both the exhibition and book came about as a response to the exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery, which my company had been invited to sponsor. They were also primarily educational in their conception and aim, which is one of the particular reasons that I decided that this subject would be appropriate to the way this frame conference has been set up. But they were undertaken from a different standpoint and tailored to slightly different ends. They also rested upon and drew from a much earlier undertaking, which became a history of European picture frames. I had in fact been commissioned in the 1980s to produce the article Frames for what is now the Grove Dictionary of Art. Serious work on this article began in 1988. The design of the dictionary meant that in order to comply with its guidelines and house style, frames had to be divided by nationality, and the whole stylistic development of construction, design, and ornament had to be dealt with separately, country by country. Because of this arrangement, weak areas of knowledge as to the frames of different countries became far more obvious. No books or articles on Scandinavian frames had ever been written, and very little research had been done into Spanish frames, except as a footnote to various other subjects, altarpieces, the Herrera style, etc. This meant that a great deal of original research and photography had to be undertaken, and the project took 8 years to complete. It also grew hugely in size, both in the number of words and illustrations, and eventually an extra section of pages had to be bound into the appropriate volume, volume 11, in order to accommodate the growth of the article, which was now 124 pages long. The scale of this original work and the final size of the article meant that the editor of the dictionary was happy to agree that it should be published separately, A History of European Picture Frames, retaining the dictionary layout of frame by nationality and the black and white illustrations and drawings of patterns with cross-sections which had been designed for the dictionary. This book was a handbook of style within nationality. The proposal of the NPG to stage an exhibition of picture frames based on its collection of British portrait frames came at a point when the end of the dictionary project was in sight, leaving in its wake a huge accumulation of new information and images covering frames from all periods and all nationalities. The logical response to the NPG project was to reuse this scholarship, firstly to complement the British-based stance of the NPG and its emphasis on portrait frames, and secondly, to redress the structuring of the dictionary article of frame styles within nationality by producing a book arranged by nationality within stylistic movement. This involved an ambitious double project. An exhibition by a commercial gallery specializing in picture frames, which was intended to widen the British focus of the NPG by covering all the material, European and chronological, which it could not supply, as well as dealing to some extent with other genres of pictures. And B, a book which simultaneously accompanied this exhibition, filled in some of the geographical and chronological areas untouched by the NPG book, and complemented the dictionary article. The book became Frameworks, and its subtitle, Form, Function and Ornament in European Portrait Frames, reveals how we concentrated on particular aspects of the frame in order to pare down the huge range of period, location and style we were dealing with, and in order to create an ordered structure for both book and exhibition. We looked at the form of the frame, and we looked at specific types of ornament. The view here was to try to enable people to identify the styles of European frames by recognizing them, which is most readily done by recognizing the ornament. We also avoided altarpieces and began with the Renaissance in Italy and the cassetta, or little box frame, the earliest type of secular frame, with a simple flat structure of a frieze between small mouldings. This frieze, which derived from the friezes of classical architecture, became progressively more decorative, refined and opulent as time went on, and eventually developed a more sculptural cross-section. By looking at the ornament used in the frieze, we could also compare it with the same ornament as it was used on furniture, in architecture, in other applied and decorative arts, and show how the frame was used to bind the painting it contained to the interior where it hung. This slide shows the first exhibit. In fact, real frames were used to display other examples of the same or similar frames, along with pieces of furniture and other objets d'art, most of which were also used as illustrations in the book. The exhibition was therefore like a living version of the book, with added frames and borrowed paintings. In this way, we could also deal with some technical processes as the NPG had done. This display board shows friezes of undulating foliage created in pastilia or thickened gesso, painted on with a brush. They include a Sienese cassone or marriage chest of around 1430 with its frame-like panels of ornament. A cassetta frame contemporary with the Madonna it contains, painted in the last quarter of the 15th century, and an early 17th century Belection frame, like the real containing frame, which has an OG cross-section pushing the painting out from the wall towards the viewer. This frame had been used for a late 17th century German Caravagese portrait. Similarly, this extremely beautiful Bolognese cassetta frame with a frieze of punchwork scrolling foliage between carved acanthus leaf and shell mouldings holds a display board with 8 different examples of frames in the same style, dating from the early 16th to the late 19th century. The central frame is contemporary with the 1875 painting, demonstrating how popular revivals of Renaissance styles were in the 19th century. The portrait in the top left-hand corner is of Georges Clemenceau by Edward Manet, an example of how a modern master can be very successfully presented in an antique frame. Equally true of the Modigliani portrait of a woman, centre right. The board beside it enlarges on these images of framed paintings by using one of the illustrations from the history, the dictionary article. It shows examples of 7 differently decorated cassetta frames with their cross-sections, from a completely plain version through ornament in pastiglia, carving, punchwork, painted faux marble, sgraffito decoration, in which a pattern is scratched through a layer of paint to reveal the gilding beneath, and engraved ornament on a textured ground. Point worth pointing out here is that all of these examples are in public collections in the dictionary so that they can actually be seen. In the same way, we were able to show displays of 17th century British and Netherlandish frames inside antique examples of the same frames. The one on the left, with applied pierced and carved giltwood foliage on a black ground, contains one of the framed British portraits which was exhibited at the Art of the Picture Frame at the NPG alongside other Netherlandish versions. It also shows a 17th century pierced silver gilt box from Augsburg and a contemporary British walnut chair as indications of how these ornamental styles diffuse through every area of art. On the right, a British gilt Sunderland frame, so-called, holds paintings in Dutch and British auricular frames, besides some painted Netherlandish interiors showing similar frames, and photos of actual interiors in British historic houses, where the historic hangings of framed portraits still survive. This combination of images illustrates the cross-pollination of frame styles, the auricular style being particularly interesting in its mixture of grotesque Italian ornament, flowing cartilaginous forms from Dutch and Bohemian silverwork, and masks, leaves, and pelt-like shapes from British so-called leatherwork frames. In the book Frameworks, we were able to back up these points with images of, for instance, Pietro Tacca's fountain in the Piazza Annunziata in Florence, in a Tintoretto portrait of 1555 in a contemporary Sansovino frame, and by the Diana and Callisto silver platter by Paulus van Vienen in the Rijksmuseum. In this context, it becomes clear how significant the frame is and how it is connected through a network of travelling craftsmen, imported ornamental prints, architecture, and souvenirs of aristocratic journeys to stylistic developments in all the applied and decorative arts throughout Europe. This tendency of styles to diffuse rapidly through many different countries becomes more rapid and more common as time goes on. The frame patterns of the Italian Renaissance are separable into regional variants for quite a long period and can be described as Venetian, Bolognese, Florentine, etc., only slowly beginning to fuse and blur together and to influence designs in countries outside Italy. However, by the 17th century, innovation in design spreads quickly, picking up idiosyncratic characteristics as it travels, creating national versions which diffuse their own influence. The auricular style is a metaphor for this, as it encompasses motives and structures from so many diverse sources. With this movement of styles and craftsmen, the artistic centres also begin to shift. Florence, so central to the Renaissance, is overtaken by Rome and Paris during the Baroque period. French Baroque frame patterns especially are seminal, producing variations of their designs in every European country. Here we can see on the left the portrait of the diarist Samuel Pepys, which formed part of the MPG Art of the Picture Frame exhibition. It is framed in a British version of a French Louis XIII frame made in 1666, 20 to 40 years after the main life of this pattern in France itself. On the right is a French Louis XIV frame with the Frameworks exhibition, from the Frameworks exhibition, showing top and centre left two more instances of the style. They would have been made in the 1650s, ironically before or contemporary with the British Louis XIII frame. These Louis XIII and Louis XIV styles are much more plastic and three-dimensional than the cassettas of Renaissance Italy. They are Baroque in their use of juxtaposed convex and concave mouldings, their use of light and shade to provide a dramatic, isolating border around the painting, and their fluid, high-relief ornament with its sense of movement and texture. This can be seen clearly in images of the 17th century version on Van Dyck's Apostle Judas and the 19th century revival of the pattern on Manet's Olympia, both of which were used as illustrations in our book Frameworks. Louis XIII and even Louis XIV frames are based on what were originally architectural styles, found on door frames and in the articulations of ceilings and cornices. The next development, the Louis XV style, which rapidly shaded into the Rococo, is much less tied to interior architecture, although it still reflects elements of carved panelling. It is an extremely sculptural style, organic, anti-geometrical, and increasingly asymmetrical, and with its prominent corner and often center cartouches, is inherently bound to the shape of the frame. The Rococo style generated different variations across Europe, with very plastic and three-dimensional ornament in France, more delicate ornament in Italy, flatter and less undercut in Britain, and with exaggerated and flyaway asymmetry in Scandinavia and Germany. The international variations of this style can be clearly seen in one of the display boards from the Frameworks exhibition. Rococo style was welcomed more wholeheartedly in some countries than others. The joy in the fantastic dash and élan of this Danish Rococo portrait frame right is palpable and contrasts with the classically regular sanded frieze and sight mouldings of the British frame on the left. This may be because, unlike France, Germany, and Scandinavia, Britain had very little Rococo architecture. It produced a great deal of Rococo furniture, liking the comfort of serpentine lines in chairs and sofas, and it created wall brackets, tables, objets d'art, and some extraordinarily imaginative and beautifully carved trophy frames. For instance, the frame on the portrait here of Admiral John Byng with its naval and military motifs, which took some getting into our building, I remember. However, the interiors of most British houses remained resolutely classical, restrained, and geometric, and the Rococo style competed against two equally classical frame styles, the native Palladian or Kent frame, which we saw earlier, and the Carlo Maratta, the British version of the Italian Salvator Rosa frame. The sanded frieze, linear sight, and small regular sight mouldings of many British Rococo frames link them to straight lines, sanded frieze, and smaller inner mouldings of Palladian frames. But these are otherwise entirely unlike Rococo styles. Palladian frames are flat, classical, and geometric, where Rococo frames are sculptural and organic, with irregular contours. Palladian frames are also an architect's design, being credited to William Kent, who had been greatly influenced by Palladian architecture in Italy. Therefore, they fit perfectly into the classical British interior of the 17th and 18th century. Similarly, the Salvator Rosa frame which was brought to England by aristocrats undertaking the Grand Tour in Italy, as we discussed earlier, fitted happily into British houses, and from the 1750s became one of the most popular frame styles under the label Carlo Maratta. It was even more adaptable to various interiors than the Kent frame, because it could be produced in any degree of opulence, from completely plain, more common in Italy than Britain, to a version covered with up to 5 runs of enrichment. Late 18th century Britain, therefore, already had a wealth of classical architecture, interiors, decorative arts and frames by the time that archaeological discoveries in Pompeii and Herculaneum mingled with a reaction against florid Rococo decoration in France to generate the neoclassical style. This was a refined and restrained version of the classical, moving away from the drama and sculptural heaviness of the Baroque period. It employed shallower profiles, varied contours, and lighter combinations of ornament. It was also the last stylistic period to see frames which were made entirely of carved giltwood. Even during the late 18th century, some runs of ornament were beginning to be moulded from papier-mâché or composition. Robert Adam in Britain, for instance, used composition pendants of leaves and husks moulded onto wire supports among the light neoclassical decoration, which was his forte. The empire of Napoleon, whose government was embarrassed for money after years of war in Europe, was a fertile and inventive ground for moulded ornament to thrive in, and produced the influential empire style, which spread rapidly across Europe. It was characterized by runs of very shallow plaster or composition ornament and decorative corners. These were far less expensive to produce than a richly carved Carlo Maratta or Rococo frame, and were both a product of the shrinking luxury market during the wars and a harbinger of the industrial processes of the 19th century. Here is part of those industrial processes. In our collection, these are from British moulds that we've collected, which are for composition ornament. They're hand carved from boxwood, an extremely hard and close-grained wood, by the few carvers who were left after the sudden disastrous disappearance of their trade. These moulds could be used time and again, and 19th century frame makers quickly assembled huge libraries of them in every size and type of motif. They are still in use today, a large and historic collection recently having been sold to a commercial workshop producing looking glass frames. They're also used in institutions such as Tate, if the right motif and the right size is available for restoration work. Otherwise, the equivalent process today employs alginate, the flexible moulding material also used for taking impressions of teeth in dental work. The traditional way of producing a frame had been for the joiner to rough out the whole structure, which the master carver would then sculpt by hand. The carving was then covered with layers of gesso and then with bowl or gilder's clay before being gilded. The gesso might be recarved to sharpen details, and the gilding might be burnished in certain areas and toned with coloured size. For the Frameworks exhibition, this was illustrated by creating a copy in various stages of the frame on one of the works which had been borrowed to display. This was a Gainsborough portrait belonging to the Dulwich Picture Gallery in London, which had a Rococo frame of the 1760s, in all probability its original frame. This juxtaposition of the 18th century framed work and the replica frame encapsulated what Jacob Simon has described as the dual purpose of understanding the historical and the technical. During the 19th century, most of these technical methods were radically simplified so that moulded ornament replaced labour-intensive hand carving, and oil gilding with cheaper base metal leaf replaced water gilding with high-quality gold. As industrialisation increased, the availability of mass-produced products like frames, and as the urban population grew with a corresponding hunger for these products, their quality tended proportionately to decrease. Plaster and compo ornament made with care from expertly carved moulds could sometimes be as refined and beautiful as carved giltwood. More frequently, it was shallow, brittle, and brassy. The academies and salons were crammed with elaborately ornamented frames, packed edge to edge, with the appearance of an immense mass of gilt gingerbread, as one of Victorian critics put it, and often even these display frames were of dubious aesthetic quality. A reaction came in the middle of the century with the pre-Raphaelites, who introduced a new golden period of frame design and radical innovation. Their frames used decorative and symbolic motifs, which were far removed from traditional and outworn styles, and which were frequently used to extend the meaning or narrative of the painting. New forms were also introduced, from the edicular temple-like frames of Burne-Jones, Lord Leighton, and Alma Tadema, to very minimal plain surfaces such as Rossetti and Holman Hunt used. Hunt was tirelessly inventive. The set of frames he made for his family portraits, including for the copy of his self-portrait by Edward Hughes, now at the Athenaeum Club in London, which was borrowed for the Frameworks exhibition, is extraordinary for the late 1860s in its pared-down structure and refined exotic ornament. The pioneering efforts of the pre-Raphaelites produced 80 or 90 years of artistic interest in custom-made frames of great aesthetic quality, including the many painted frames of the early 20th century. Eventually, another wave of reaction brought this to an end and also led to the destruction of many decorative antique frames in the name of modernism. The NPG exhibited in the Art of the Picture Frame a label which the artist John Bratby used to stick on the back of his paintings in the 1960s. He preferred no frame at all, but where there was a frame, he laid down that it should only cover the strips of battening nailed along the edges of the canvas for that purpose, rather than any part of the painting at all, thereby precluding stupid and Philistine encroachment upon the periphery of the picture surface. I can recall unframing a Monet that the entire signature had been covered up by an inch of the frame's rebate. And tape measure accident, no doubt. Fortunately, with the publication of Klaus Grimm's Alte Bilderrahmen in 1978 and its translation into English in 1981 as the Book of Picture Frames, a gradual awakening of the art of historical establishment to the value and importance of frames began, and the events and publications of 1996 were an important staging post in this process. Just as the art of the picture frame at the NPG continued to exert huge influence and to provide a centre for research and reference on the NPG website, the book and exhibition frameworks also produced and continued to produce fruit. The Paul Mitchell archive of frame images has grown steadily, providing the basis for a brochure on the best frames in the collections, first of the Detroit Institute of Arts and then for the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. We have details here of the Detroit one. The most recent of these museum-based projects has involved the cataloguing of the entire frame collection belonging to the Yale Center for British Art in New Haven, Connecticut. Every frame on each painting in the Paul Mellon collection was photographed by myself, entered into a database, dated and described. The database was then uploaded onto the Yale website, giving access to every frame as much as to every painting. This is an intricate and continuing process which will result in the linking of all the data and images on the pictures and their respective frames. It has also inspired other museums to see the necessity of cataloguing their own frame collections. The Royal Academy London, with its large collection of diploma paintings by every major British artist since the late 18th century, all still in their original frames, is one example. Another offshoot is the Frame blog, launched and managed by my co-author in all these framing projects, Lynn Roberts, on an online magazine of articles, reviews, and news of events to do with the history of frames. It is subscribed to by museums, conservators, collectors, and interested individuals all over the world, and has contributors in Britain, the US, Russia, and Scandinavia. It is further recognition of the importance of digital media in the collation and diffusion of knowledge, especially for a subject which embraces so many national designs and so many links with architecture, social history, and the decorative arts. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.